History tells us the Nazis lost the war, but it never tells us what they tried to hide. Behind sealed vaults, coded files, and erased records were secrets so disturbing even their own leaders tried to bury them. From hidden operations to vanished masterminds and underground projects, this is the side of the Third Reich that was never meant to be seen. Tonight, we're opening those doors. These aren't rumors. These are documented truths, forgotten deals, and secrets that survived destruction. Stay with us, because the deeper we go, the more dangerous the truth becomes. And before we dive in, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss the next story we uncover here. It really helps this channel keep bringing these hidden histories to light. And while you're here, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel across the world. 1. Operation Bernhard. The SS printed fake British money to fund espionage. In the middle of a world war, while bombs fell and armies clashed, a quieter operation was unfolding behind locked doors. One of the most audacious financial crimes in history. Known as Operation Bernhard, it was an SS-run counterfeiting project designed to undermine Britain and secretly fund Nazi intelligence. Instead of crude forgeries, this program produced near-perfect copies of British banknotes, so convincing that even experts struggled to tell them apart. The work was carried out by a group of imprisoned specialists, engravers, printers, artists, and bankers, who were forced to use their skills for the Reich. Their workshop was hidden inside a concentration camp, yet it operated with the precision of a world-class printing house. At first, the goal was to flood Britain with fake money and trigger inflation. But when that proved impractical, the project took on an even more shadowy role, financing espionage, bribery, and black market purchases across Europe. These notes paid for intelligence agents, safe houses, travel documents, and weapons, all while leaving almost no paper trail back to Berlin. That was exactly why the program stayed buried in secrecy. It wasn't just a crime, it was a weaponized banking system. After the war, scattered records and survivor testimony slowly revealed the truth, but it remained overshadowed by the scale of battlefield events. Yet this secret shows how modern and ruthless Nazi planning really was, turning money itself into a tool of warfare. And behind that money trail lies an even darker ledger, one that leads straight into the vaults of Germany's central bank, where the next secret waited to be quietly recorded. 2. The Melmer account. The Reichsbank quietly logged. SS shipments of victim gold. While Operation Bernhard created money from nothing, another secret system dealt in wealth taken from human lives. Inside the Reichsbank, Nazi Germany's central bank, a special accounting channel existed that few people outside the SS ever noticed. It was known as the Melmer account, named after the officer who delivered its deposits. These deposits were not ordinary state funds. They came from SS shipments that included jewelry, coins, dental gold, and other valuables taken from people who had been murdered or imprisoned. Once delivered, these materials were processed, melted down, and quietly folded into the financial bloodstream of the Nazi state. What makes this especially chilling is how normal it all looked on paper. Clerks logged entries, officials balanced books, and gold moved through the system as if it were just another commodity. There were no dramatic labels, no moral alarms, just bureaucratic routines that turned mass theft into official revenue. This is why the truth stayed hidden for so long. The story was buried not in secret bunkers, but in accounting files that looked painfully ordinary. Only after the war did investigators uncover how deeply the financial system had been intertwined with the machinery of persecution. It wasn't chaos. It was organized, documented, and quietly efficient. And once you realize how smoothly this system ran, another disturbing question emerges. If the Nazis could build a financial pipeline for stolen wealth, what else did they construct long before the world noticed? The answer takes us to a program that began even before their most infamous crimes were fully underway. And before we move on, if this story has you hooked, Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. It's the best way to support the channel. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's incredible to see how these stories connect people all over the world. 3. Action T4. A mass killing program that started before the final solution. Years before the Nazi leadership openly set out to erase entire populations, they had already tested the machinery of organized killing on a smaller, more hidden scale. This program was called Action T4, and it targeted people the regime labeled as unfit or unproductive, those with physical or mental disabilities, and people living in institutions. Beginning in 1939, long before the extermination camps became fully operational, specially designated facilities were set up to carry out this program under a veil of medical authority. Families were told their loved ones were being transferred for treatment. In reality, they were never meant to return. Public backlash eventually forced the regime to halt the program in its original form, but it didn't truly stop. Instead, it went underground, spreading into other parts of the Nazi system under different names and administrative tricks. What made Action T4 so important and so dangerous was that it created the blueprint for everything that followed. Centralized planning, secret facilities, coded paperwork, and a workforce trained to carry out lethal policies while hiding them behind euphemisms. For years, this story was overshadowed by later horrors, yet it reveals a crucial truth. The path toward genocide did not begin suddenly. It was built step by step, tested in silence, and refined through bureaucracy. And once the Nazis learned how to erase people while erasing the evidence, they went even further, launching operations designed not just to kill, but to make the past itself disappear. 4. Action 1005. The Nazis ran corpse units to erase the evidence. By the time the war began to turn against Germany, the Nazi leadership faced a new and terrifying problem: proof. Across Eastern Europe, vast killing sites and mass burial grounds had accumulated over years of occupation. These places were not meant to be seen by outsiders, yet advancing armies and investigators threatened to expose what had been done. To deal with this, the SS launched one of its most secretive operations, known as Action 1005. Its purpose was chillingly simple: remove traces of earlier crimes before anyone else could document them. Specially selected prisoner teams were forced to reopen burial sites, remove remains, and destroy them using improvised industrial methods. Everything was done in extreme secrecy. Workers were isolated, guarded, and moved frequently so they could not understand the scale of what they were part of. Even many German officials had no idea this program existed because it was designed to be compartmentalized. Orders passed through a narrow chain of command, and records were deliberately vague or destroyed. What makes Action 1005 so shocking is that it shows how much effort the regime invested not just in wrongdoing, but in rewriting reality itself. This was history being edited in real time, with the goal of leaving nothing behind but empty ground and silence. And once you see how far the Nazis went to clean up the past, it becomes easier to understand how boldly they planned the future. Because at the very same time, they were drafting a blueprint for an entirely new Eastern Europe. 5. General Plan Ost, the blueprint for a post-war ethnic re-engineering of Eastern Europe. While Action 1005 was busy erasing evidence of past actions, another project was being developed for a future the Nazis believed they would soon control. This plan, known as General Plan Ost, was nothing less than a vision for reshaping Eastern Europe after a German victory. It outlined how entire populations would be removed, displaced, or reduced in number, while millions of settlers from Germany would be moved in to take their place. It wasn't just military occupation, it was demographic engineering on a continental scale. What makes this plan so disturbing is how calmly it was written. It was not a speech or a threat. It was a bureaucratic document, filled with charts, targets, and timelines. Administrators discussed how much land would be seized, how many people would be relocated, and how resources would be redirected. Some versions of the plan were destroyed, which is why only fragments survive today, but enough remains to show its brutal intent. Eastern Europe was to be transformed into a colonial empire, run for German benefit, and stripped of its original identity. The reason General Plan Ost stayed hidden for so long is simple. It was never meant for public eyes. It was a behind-the-scenes roadmap for a world that, thankfully, never came to pass. But planning on this scale required something even more ruthless, a way to control food, life, and survival itself. That brings us to the next secret, where spreadsheets and supply chains became instruments of quiet devastation. 6. The Hunger Plan, a starvation policy hidden behind food logistics. As the Nazis pushed eastward, they encountered a problem that armies have faced for centuries: how to feed themselves. But instead of treating this as a logistical challenge, Nazi planners turned it into a policy of deliberate exclusion. The Hunger Plan was designed to divert food from the occupied Soviet territories back to Germany, ensuring that German civilians and soldiers were supplied, even if that meant entire regions would be left with nothing. In private documents, officials openly acknowledged that large numbers of people would not survive this shift. They accepted it as the cost of victory. What made the plan especially insidious was how it was framed. On paper, it looked like a rational economic strategy, focused on grain quotas, transport routes, and storage. But behind those neutral words was the reality of deliberate deprivation. Cities and rural areas alike were stripped of their harvests, while German supply trains rolled westward. Because it was written in the language of administration, not violence, the policy stayed largely invisible to outsiders at the time. After the war, this system was harder to explain than a single atrocity, because it spread harm through routine decisions. Yet it may have claimed as many lives as weapons ever did. And as the Nazis quietly engineered survival and death through food, they were also building something far more overtly destructive, an entire category of weapons that would terrify the world once it was finally revealed. 7. Nerve agents in the Third Reich, Germany, stockpiled tabun, then didn't use it. Long before most of the world realized how dangerous chemical warfare could become, Nazi Germany had already crossed a terrifying scientific threshold. In secret laboratories, German chemists discovered a new class of substances far more potent than anything used in World War I. One of them, known as tabun, was the first of what we now call nerve agents. It was so powerful that even tiny amounts could overwhelm the human body. The discovery was immediately classified, and production facilities were built to turn this laboratory breakthrough into a military stockpile. By the later years of the war, Germany had manufactured thousands of tons of these agents and stored them in specially designed munitions. Yet strangely, they were never used on the battlefield. Historians believe this restraint came not from mercy, but from fear. Nazi leaders suspected the Allies might possess similar weapons, and a chemical exchange could spiral out of control. In that sense, the existence of tabun created a grim standoff, with both sides terrified of triggering a chain reaction they could not stop. For decades, this story remained in the shadows, overshadowed by nuclear weapons and other horrors. But the truth is that the chemical age of warfare had already begun inside the Third Reich, and the same system that produced these weapons was also altering the minds and bodies of its own soldiers in a far more personal way, using substances that were openly handed out as tools of war. 8. Pervitin, methamphetamine, was normalized as a military aid. While scientists were developing secret chemical weapons, a very different substance was being distributed openly across the German armed forces. Pervitin, a form of methamphetamine, was promoted as a way to keep soldiers alert, focused, and fearless. It was sold in pharmacies, included in military rations, and even recommended by doctors. The idea was simple. A chemically enhanced soldier could march longer, fight harder, and ignore exhaustion that would normally slow a human body down. During the early campaigns of the war, especially in rapid advances across Europe, this drug became part of daily life for many troops. It helped fuel the image of unstoppable armies moving day and night, pushing far beyond normal limits. But it came at a cost. Dependence, crashes in energy, and emotional instability followed, even if these consequences were rarely discussed in official reports. The regime preferred to highlight discipline and strength, not the reality of chemical support. For years, this story was dismissed as rumor or exaggeration, yet documents and medical records later confirmed how widespread it truly was. The Nazi war machine was not just mechanical, it was pharmacological. And behind these chemically driven campaigns, another group of scientists was being quietly monitored by the Allies as they tried to discover just how close Germany had come to the ultimate weapon. 9. Farm Hall. Allies secretly bugged captured German nuclear scientists. When the war ended in Europe, the Allies were left with a critical question. How far had German scientists progressed toward building an atomic weapon? To find out, they took an extraordinary step. 10 of Germany's leading nuclear researchers were quietly moved to a large house in England called Farm Hall. The men were told they were being held comfortably until their future was decided. What they did not know was that every room in the building was secretly wired with listening devices. For months, their private conversations were recorded. They talked about physics, politics, and their own wartime roles, often with surprising honesty. Then, when news of the atomic bomb dropped on Japan, their reactions revealed what they truly understood about nuclear technology. Some were stunned. Others tried to explain why Germany had not achieved the same result, and many began to distance themselves from responsibility. These transcripts remained classified for years because they were politically sensitive and deeply revealing. They showed not just technical limits, but human ones: pride, denial, and self-protection. And once you hear what these scientists said when they thought no one was listening, you begin to wonder what else the collapsing Reich tried to hide in its final months. That leads straight into one of the war's strangest construction mysteries, buried deep beneath the mountains. 10. Project Riese, a giant underground build, whose purpose remains unclear. As Allied forces closed in from every direction, the Nazi leadership poured enormous resources into a last wave of secret construction. One of the strangest of these efforts was Project Riese, a massive network of underground tunnels and chambers carved into the mountains of Lower Silesia. Thousands of forced laborers were pushed to dig deep into rock, creating halls large enough to hold factories, command centers, or something else entirely. What makes Project Riese so mysterious is not just its scale, but the absence of clear documentation explaining what it was truly meant for. Some historians believe it was intended as a protected headquarters for top leaders. Others think it was meant to house advanced weapons production, shielded from bombing. A few even suggest it could have combined several purposes at once. But the truth is that many of the relevant files were destroyed as the Reich collapsed, leaving only blueprints, unfinished tunnels, and scattered testimony. What remains today is a physical puzzle beneath the mountains, a concrete reminder of how much was hidden during those final desperate months. The lack of answers is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate secrecy. And one of the key figures tied to these underground projects was a man who vanished so completely that even his fate became a mystery, pulling historians into decades of debate. 11. The Kammler Problem. One of the SS's most powerful technocrats disappeared. Hans Kammler was not a famous public figure, but inside the Nazi system he wielded enormous power. As an SS general and engineer, he oversaw some of the regime's most secret and ambitious projects, including underground factories and advanced weapons programs. He controlled budgets, labor, and construction on a scale that rivaled entire ministries. By 1945, Kammler knew more about Germany's hidden infrastructure than almost anyone else alive. Then, just as the war ended, he vanished. Different stories emerged almost immediately. Some claimed he had taken his own life. Others believed he escaped. possibly with help from Western intelligence agencies interested in what he knew. There are even reports suggesting he was captured and interrogated in secret. What makes this so troubling is that there is no single piece of evidence that definitively closes the case. The chaos of Germany's collapse, combined with deliberate destruction of records, created a fog that has never fully lifted. Kammler's disappearance matters because he sat at the crossroads of technology, secrecy, and power. If anyone carried dangerous knowledge out of the Third Reich, it was him. And that possibility leads directly into another hidden chapter, where SS officers and Allied agents met in secret to negotiate a surrender that nearly shattered wartime alliances. 12. Operation Sunrise. Secret SS OSS. Talks for a local surrender in Italy. In the early months of 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, something extraordinary was happening behind closed doors in neutral Switzerland. While battles still raged in Italy, representatives of the American Intelligence Service and a high-ranking SS general named Karl Wolff began secret discussions about surrendering German forces in northern Italy. This effort, known as Operation Sunrise, was designed to shorten the fighting and prevent further destruction in that region. The talks were kept so quiet that even some Allied leaders were not fully informed. The reason was political as much as military. If the negotiations became public, they could appear to be a separate peace, undermining the fragile unity between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. When word eventually leaked, it caused intense anger in Moscow, planting seeds of mistrust that would soon grow into Cold War suspicion. Operation Sunrise did lead to a successful surrender, saving countless lives, but it also exposed how quickly wartime cooperation could fracture. It showed that even as the Nazis were collapsing, their officers still had bargaining power. And some of them used that leverage not just to end fighting, but to secure new roles in a rapidly changing world, setting the stage for a shadowy intelligence network that would soon be reborn under a different flag. 13. The Gehlen Network. Nazi intelligence was recycled into early Cold War espionage. As Germany collapsed, one group within the Nazi system realized something crucial. Information could be more valuable than weapons. Reinhard Gehlen, who had run military intelligence focused on the Soviet Union, understood that his files, contacts, and analysis might buy him protection in a new world dominated by East-West rivalry. Instead of destroying his archives, he arranged to have them hidden. When American forces arrived, Gehlen made a calculated offer. In exchange for safety and support, he would turn over everything he knew about the Soviet bloc. The deal was accepted. Under American oversight, Gehlen and many of his former colleagues were allowed to rebuild an intelligence organization that soon became a core part of West Germany's new security services. This created a remarkable continuity between the Third Reich and the early Cold War. Men who had once served a totalitarian state now worked as partners of Western democracies, providing intelligence that was considered too valuable to ignore. The arrangement was deeply controversial, but it was also real. Files, funding, and operational networks crossed the boundary between war and peace almost intact. What made this so secretive was how much it clashed with the public story of a clean break from the Nazi past. And if intelligence officers could be quietly repurposed, it raises a troubling question. How many others slipped away through similar hidden pathways? 14. Rat lines. Post-war escape pathways that benefited Nazi perpetrators. In the chaos after the war, Europe was flooded with displaced people, broken records, and improvised borders. That disorder created opportunities for those who wanted to disappear. Out of this environment emerged a loose network of escape routes known as the rat lines. These pathways helped some former Nazi officials and collaborators travel from Germany and Austria through countries like Italy and Spain, and on to destinations in South America or the Middle East. The system was not a single organization, but a patchwork of helpers, forged documents, sympathetic officials, and gaps in enforcement. Some participants claimed they were simply offering humanitarian aid. Others were driven by politics, seeing these men as useful allies against communism. Whatever the motives, the result was that many individuals who should have faced justice instead vanished into new lives under new names. For decades, the full scale of the ratlines was obscured by destroyed paperwork and official reluctance to reopen old wounds. But piece by piece, historians uncovered enough evidence to show these routes were real and effective. And while some escaped across oceans, another group of children was being quietly moved and renamed inside Europe itself, under a program that blurred ideology with family life. 15. Lebensborn's reality, not a breeding farm myth, but a real SS social engineering system. The Lebensborn program has long been surrounded by rumors and exaggerations, but its true nature is unsettling enough on its own. Created by the SS, it was meant to increase the number of children considered racially desirable by Nazi ideology. It provided support for mothers, arranged adoptions, and established homes where selected families could raise children under close supervision. On paper, it looked like a welfare project. In reality, it was a tool of social engineering. In occupied territories, the program took on an even darker complexity. Children who fit racial criteria were sometimes removed from their communities and placed into German families, their identities rewritten. Records were altered, names changed, and pasts erased, all in the service of a vision of a future population shaped by ideology rather than heritage. After the war, many of these children struggled to uncover who they really were. Files were missing, memories conflicted, and institutions avoided responsibility. The story stayed hidden for so long because it touched something deeply personal: family, identity, and belonging. And when you realize how far the SS went to manipulate human origins, it becomes easier to understand why they also invested in bizarre quests for ancient roots, sending their agents to the far edges of the world in search of ideological proof. 16. The SS in Tibet. Ahnenerbe-linked expeditions, mixed science, racial theory, and mystique. In the late 1930s, while Europe was moving steadily toward war, a small group of German researchers traveled thousands of miles to one of the most remote regions on Earth. Backed by the SS and an organization called the Ahnenerbe, the 1938-1939 expedition to Tibet was officially described as a scientific mission. Its members measured skulls, mapped landscapes, collected artifacts, and documented local culture. On the surface, it looked like anthropology. Beneath that surface, however, lay an ideological agenda: to search for evidence that could support Nazi theories about ancient origins and racial hierarchy. This blend of science and belief made the expedition deeply unusual. Real data was gathered, but it was interpreted through a political lens that sought to validate preconceived ideas. After the war, this episode was often ignored or turned into sensational myths about hidden powers and lost civilizations. In reality, it was more unsettling than any fantasy. A modern state had funded research not to discover truth, but to justify prejudice. Because the expedition did not fit neatly into military history, it faded from public memory. Yet it shows how far the SS was willing to go to give its worldview a scientific disguise. And while some Nazis were chasing ancient legends in the Himalayas, others were busy fabricating modern lies at home, staging events that would help launch a global conflict. 17. Operation Himmler, false flag attacks used to prove. Poland started the war. As Germany prepared to invade Poland in 1939, the Nazi leadership needed a story to tell the world. They wanted to appear as if they were responding to aggression rather than committing it. To do this, they created Operation Himmler, a plan to stage fake incidents along the German-Polish border. These were designed to look like Polish attacks on German targets, complete with radio broadcasts and planted evidence. One of the most famous of these incidents involved a radio station, where the illusion of an assault was broadcast to justify immediate retaliation. The goal was not to convince careful investigators, but to provide a simple narrative for newspapers and the public. It was a performance crafted to give invasion the appearance of defense. For years, these events were shrouded in confusion and propaganda. Only later did documents and testimonies reveal how carefully they had been arranged. Operation Himmler shows that deception was not just a tool of wartime diplomacy, it was built into the very start of the conflict. And once the machinery of war was in motion, it quickly evolved into something far more organized and deadly, with entire regions turned into systems of control and exploitation. 18. Action. Reinhardt's balance sheet. Mass murder was also a meticulous profit machine. As the Nazi regime expanded its control, it also built a vast system to extract wealth from the people it targeted. Action Reinhardt was one of the clearest examples of this. Beyond its role in destruction, it functioned as a highly organized economic operation. Property, clothing, currency, and personal valuables were collected, sorted, recorded, and shipped into the Reich's financial networks. Nothing was considered too small to be accounted for. What makes this so striking is how methodical it was. Detailed reports listed quantities, values, and destinations. Trains moved goods just as they moved people, and administrators treated stolen belongings like inventory in a warehouse. The cold efficiency of this process revealed how deeply economic motives were woven into ideological policies. After the war, these financial records became crucial evidence, but for a long time they were overshadowed by the broader story of conflict. Yet they show something important. The Nazi system was designed to profit from its own crimes. And once you understand that, another hidden chapter comes into focus, one involving exploitation that was rarely discussed, because it carried a heavy social silence even long after the war ended. 19. Camp brothels. Forced sexual labor was organized and kept quiet. Within the tightly controlled world of the concentration camp system, the SS created another layer of hidden exploitation that remained largely unspoken for decades. Certain camps were assigned special buildings known as Sonderbauten, which were officially described in vague administrative language. In reality, these spaces were used to coerce imprisoned women into providing sexual services under SS control. The regime presented this as a way to increase productivity and reward selected prisoners. But in practice, it was another system of domination built on fear, pressure, and total lack of choice. What made this especially difficult to uncover after the war was the deep social stigma surrounding the topic. Many survivors felt unable to speak publicly about what had happened, and many perpetrators avoided leaving written records. As a result, historians had to piece together the truth from scattered testimonies, camp documents, and post-war investigations. Over time, a clearer picture emerged. This was not random abuse, but an organized policy embedded within the camp structure. The silence surrounding these places lasted far longer than the buildings themselves. Even today, they are often left out of popular histories, despite being an important part of how the system of control operated. And just as these hidden spaces existed within camps, entire vaults of stolen wealth were being concealed underground, waiting to be discovered only when the war was already over. 20. Merker's Mine Treasure, a hidden Reichsbank cache found underground. As the Third Reich began to crumble, Nazi officials scrambled to protect what they considered vital assets. Gold, currency, and valuables taken from across occupied Europe were packed up and moved away from major cities, where they could be bombed or seized. One of the largest of these secret transfers ended up deep inside a salt mine near the town of Merkers. There, behind heavy doors and in carefully arranged storage rooms, the Reichsbank hid a vast hoard of wealth. When American forces reached the area in 1945, they made an astonishing discovery. Stacked inside the mine were gold bars, sacks of currency, and countless other items that revealed just how much had been taken and concentrated by the Nazi state. It was not just a treasure trove, it was a physical record of a massive system of plunder. The secrecy surrounding this cache was intentional. The goal was to preserve financial leverage even after military defeat. In that sense, Merkers was meant to be a bridge to a future that never came. But this underground wealth was only one part of a much larger hidden industry, because in another location, forced labor was being used to produce one of the most dangerous weapons ever invented. 21. De Herrnfurth's Forced Labor Chemical Complex, a factory built around a secret weapon. Far from the front lines in occupied territory, the Nazi chemical weapons program was quietly expanding. One of its most important centers was at De Herrnfurth, where factories were built to produce nerve agents like tabun. This was not a simple laboratory. It was an entire industrial complex designed to turn scientific formulas into large-scale stockpiles. To keep it running, the regime relied heavily on forced labor, drawing people from nearby camps and placing them into highly controlled work environments. The secrecy surrounding this facility was extreme. Workers were isolated, information was compartmentalized, and even many German officials had little idea what was truly being made there. What they did know was that this plant was considered critical to Germany's future power. If the war had continued longer, its output could have reshaped the battlefield in unimaginable ways. For decades, Die Herrnfurth was barely mentioned outside specialized histories. Its combination of advanced chemistry, industrial scale, and coerced labor did not fit easily into simple narratives of the war. Yet it shows how deeply technology and exploitation were intertwined in the Nazi system. And just as these secret weapons were hidden behind factory walls, another set of institutions hid dangerous ideas behind the appearance of respectable research. 22. Ahnenerbe's respectable mask. Pseudoscience in uniform. To the outside world, many Nazi research institutions looked like ordinary academic bodies. They published reports, held conferences, and sent expeditions around the globe. One of the most influential of these groups was the SS-backed Ahnenerbe. It presented itself as a scholarly organization devoted to studying history, archaeology, folklore, and human origins. But behind this professional appearance was a powerful ideological mission: to produce evidence that supported Nazi racial beliefs and political goals. Real scholars worked alongside party loyalists, and genuine fieldwork was mixed with deeply biased interpretation. Findings were selectively used to support preconceived theories about ancient civilizations and supposed hierarchies of humanity. Because it wore the clothing of science, the Ahnenerbe was able to gain funding, credibility, and institutional support that more openly political propaganda never could. After the war, many people preferred to forget this chapter, since it showed how easily respectable institutions could be bent to serve harmful ideas. The story is unsettling not because of mystery, but because of how ordinary it looked. And that quiet respectability connects directly to another hidden record, one where influential figures spoke freely when they believed no one was listening, leaving behind a rare and revealing window into how they really saw their own actions. 23. We didn't know on tape. Farm Hall captures the psychology of post-war self-exculpation. When German nuclear scientists were secretly held at Farm Hall, they believed their conversations were private. In reality, every word was being recorded. What those recordings captured was not just technical discussion, but the emotional and psychological reactions of men trying to make sense of a defeated world. When they learned about the atomic bomb used by the Allies, their surprise, confusion, and sometimes defensiveness revealed how they viewed their own roles during the war. Some insisted they had never truly tried to build such a weapon. Others argued that their failure was due to lack of resources rather than lack of intention. What makes these tapes so important is their spontaneity. These were not polished interviews or courtroom statements. They were unguarded moments where pride, regret, and self-protection collided. For decades, the recordings were kept secret because they challenged comfortable narratives. They showed how easily people could distance themselves from responsibility once events turned against them. And that pattern of quiet maneuvering and private explanation did not end in Farm Hall. It also shaped how wartime diplomacy was later remembered, especially in a tense episode that deepened mistrust between former allies. 24. Separate peace panic. Operation Sunrise helped trigger early Cold War. Distrust. Operation Sunrise had officially ended fighting in northern Italy, but its political consequences lasted far longer. When Soviet leaders discovered that secret talks had taken place between American intelligence officers and SS representatives, they saw it as proof that the Western Allies might be willing to strike deals behind their backs. Even though the negotiations were meant to save lives and shorten the war, they planted a seed of suspicion that would grow rapidly in the post-war world. Diplomatic messages, intelligence reports, and private meetings were filled with tension over what had really been discussed in Switzerland. Each side feared that the other was shaping the future of Europe without transparency. This episode became one of the early signals that cooperation during the war was giving way to rivalry in peace. Because no one wanted to admit how fragile Allied unity had become, the story of Operation Sunrise was pushed to the margins of history. Yet it reveals how quickly alliances can fracture when secrets are involved. And just as political trust was breaking down, historians were left facing an even deeper problem. Some of the Third Reich's final secrets may never be fully known at all, because the evidence itself was deliberately erased. 25. The Secret Purposes Trap. Some Nazi secrets are real because documentation was destroyed. In the final months of the Third Reich, something unusual happened that still shapes how historians understand Nazi secrets today. An enormous amount of documentation vanished. Offices were burned, archives were shredded, and files were moved or hidden just as Allied armies closed in. This was not panic alone. It was policy. Nazi leaders understood that paperwork was power, and destroying it could protect people, projects, and reputations long after the war was lost. That is why so many late-war programs, underground facilities, and high-ranking figures remain surrounded by unanswered questions. Cases like Project Rees and Hans Kammler show how this worked in practice. We can see the physical remains, tunnels, buildings, contracts, but the records that would explain their full purpose are missing. Interrogations, survivor accounts, and scattered memos give us fragments, but never the whole picture. This creates a dangerous trap. Real secrecy can start to look like wild speculation, even when it is grounded in evidence. The truth is that some Nazi mysteries exist not because of fantasy, but because the system of concealment succeeded. The regime was built to compartmentalize, to destroy traces, and to leave future investigators with puzzles instead of answers. And that, in many ways, is the final legacy of Nazi secrecy. A reminder that power does not only operate through what is done, but through what is hidden, lost, or deliberately made unknowable.